things, I'm really glad to know about the origins of the marijuana initiative. My wife thinks I just came out here to get high.
Too early.
But, no, John, I do have the affiliation, I'm now on the board, I'm really proud to be on the board, and, John, the Economic Opportunity Institute has done great work in just, starting with the minimum wage, that's the first thing I know you guys are doing, and, that really was a great thing, it really was path-breaking, because so many other states, you wandered over here, wandered overwhelmingly, got people out to vote for other offices, this has been copied in, cities and states around the country now, and it really has a huge impact. One of the things, we end up setting our sights so low, and not to say John set sights low, but one of the things that's just striking to think about, and I don't know why this hadn't occurred to me. I was talking with one of my colleagues, John Schmidt, a few weeks ago, and I'd known this before, but I just happened to look at it. I go, minimum wage had kept pace with productivity since the late 60s. It'd be about $18 an hour, which is kind of an incredible thing. Just so you know, so it's not like a fanciful thing. I mean, I think we're going to get this tomorrow or anything like that. But it actually did keep pace with productivity from we first set the minimum wage in 1937 until the late 60s. It actually did keep pace with productivity. So the idea that you would do that, you did have people, Republicans even, who thought that was a reasonable thing for, that 30 years or so from when we first established the federal minimum wage until the late 60s, when they did start to let it fall behind productivity. So it's not like a far-fetched thing. It actually did happen for a substantial period of time. If you thought it was ruining the economy, the unemployment rate in '69 was about 3%. So it didn't ruin the economy. So anyhow, the interesting thing to think about. But what I wanted to talk is some of the diversion from that. The title of my book, The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive, and if anyone's interested, I don't have a book to sign. I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy because I have my dog on the cover. I'll explain that. One of my dogs on the cover. I'll explain that in a second. But anyone who's interested, you can just click on and download it for free. So anyone who's interested,
Thank you.
Exactly. You could so you could download it for free, and if you have a reader, it's in whatever format. We have several different formats, so anyone who's got different types of readers, you can get that. The logic, the end of loser liberalism. People go, what the hell do you mean by that? Well, the logic here is, I'm beating up on friends in Washington, some of whom aren't necessarily friends, but there's a philosophy a lot of people have about their view of politics, that we have the markets are out there, and some people get very, very rich. You have your Bill Gates here and Bezos and people like that. People get very rich, then others don't do that well. And because we're good people and we feel compassion for them, we want to help out the losers. And that's something I find really appalling. And the point of this, it's not that I don't want to help out the people who didn't do well, but the point of the book was it wasn't just that they didn't do well, the game was rigged. And I think that's really important, both for the political message, because I think it's there's sort of, I'll confess, a double entendre here, loser. It's a loser message. We don't want to go around to tell people we want to help the losers out there. I think that's a bad political message. But it's bad policy, because they weren't just losers. It was rigged against them. And the point of the book is to go through how it's rigged against them. And to show you, I should have brought at least a copy of my book with me so I could show you the picture of my dog. I have 3 dogs. We're big dog people. My wife and I are big dog people, both in the sense we really like dogs, but we like big dogs. so I have Doberman, we have this Shepherd Border Collie mix. They're both very big dogs. And then we got stuck with this Bichon. And I mean that quite literally. We got stuck with him because my wife was fostering him, and she found a home. We thought, well, that's great. This woman seems to really like him. This and that. Anyhow, the woman called us up like 6 months later. She goes, I really want to give him back. So I go, okay, and anyhow, so I figured, okay, what happened. So what do? We exploit him and put him on the cover of our book. So we thought he made a good symbol for loser liberalism. But anyhow, the point of the book is I try to go through various ways in which the markets have been. There we go. You can see Biscuit. You came with the name Biscuit. I want to name you Snack.
For the Doberman.
Exactly. But in the book, I try to go through ways in which the government has rigged the market. So it's not just that, as I say, Bezos and Gates got very rich. I don't doubt they're very smart and work very hard and all that, but it's not just that they got very rich. We rigged the deck that way, and you end up with people being losers. Let me just go through 3 ways that I consider very important that have had that sort of rigging. One of them is going to be talking about patents and copyrights. I'll focus on patents, particularly patents and prescription drugs. This is a government intervention in the market, so this is a very, very important point. I say this with economists. It's not that I think economists are brilliant people or anything, but they should know about the economy. Patents are a government intervention, and it's not to say that they're bad. It's simply that they're government intervention. We should be debating whether they're good or bad, or whether they're good or bad in this or that circumstance. But these are interventions, patents and copyrights. They're government monopolies. I want to go out and make a copy of the latest version of Windows and hand it out to people for free. Well, Bill Gates would have me arrested for that. That's not a free market. That's not a free market. It might be a good thing, but it's not a free market. The second thing I want to talk about is trade. You often hear it said, it's just really too bad. Those people in China, they're displacing us because displacing our manufacturing workers because they're willing to work for such low wages. That's true. But they could also displace other workers, and the reason they don't is because of the way in which we structure trade. So I think a very, very important point. And you have a lot of people who are convinced that they're just really a hell of a lot smarter than Chinese, and that's why they have good jobs at high pay and manufacturing workers don't. No, it's they have protectionism. They're just not. The third thing I want to talk about is the structure of the labor market. I can go on a great, great length there, but I want to pick up actually on something that John was saying about paid sick days. It's not, when we talk about not having enough work, it's actually, if you think about it for a second, that's a great problem to have. We don't have enough work, well, we're producing whatever we're producing, and with people who could be working and they're not, well, that's kind of a good thing in a sense. I mean, it's not good they're unemployed, but that's a problem of wealth, not a problem of poverty. And one of the ways you can get around that is having people work. So I want to talk a little bit about that, just this idea that, sort of we have fixed work years, how long we work. That's not fixed. That's set by institutions, and those could be changed. We've changed it here, and in other countries they actually work much, much less. Okay, so I want to sort of go through that basic story. All right, well, let me start with the beginning, talking about patents, because this is something, I first began to look at this back about 15 years ago, thinking, I was focused on prescription drugs, because, obviously it's important for health, but it's also a lot of money. And I remember just curious. It's not my area. It wasn't my area of research. I was just curious. I was going, well, why is it that we have patents on prescription drugs as the way to finance them? I mean, I understand where you have to give people an incentive, but there are different ways. Why do we think this is the best way to do that? And what I'm saying, in different ways. We spend $30 billion a year at the National Institutes of Health funding biomedical research. So we obviously can fund research through other mechanisms, and you could think of other ways. So I thought I'd go look it up and see, what the research was that showed that patents were the best way to do it. Well, I didn't find anything. There was nothing on that. And the idea that this is a small thing, because I sometimes raise this with economists, they're like, hey, whatever, it's a small thing. But no, it's actually, we spend it's about $270 billion a year that we spend on prescription drugs. And suppose we snapped our fingers, we got rid of patent and related protection, it's about a tenth that. Okay, drugs, with very few exceptions, are cheap to produce. And one way you know this, if you go to a chain drugstore and get generic drugs, typically $5, $6, $7. You can rarely pay more than that for a generic. The drugs that are patented are selling for 500, 1,000 more prescriptions sometimes. The only difference is that they have a legal monopoly. It's not that those drugs are uniquely hard to produce, it's they have a legal monopoly. So we're spending a huge amount of money, and just to put this in some scale, we're having this big debate about, we have to reduce the deficit, different targets coming out there, and we typically talk about over a 10-year period. If you took that gap, 27 billion versus 270 billion, obviously they're very rough numbers, 240 billion a year, and that's supposed to rise. So if you took that over the course of the decade, you'd be talking about somewhere in the order of $3 trillion. Okay, that's a huge amount of money. And no one talks about that, So this is an enormous amount of money that goes from, us as consumers. I mean, sometimes it's going, sometimes it's directly from the government because the government buys drugs through Medicaid, Medicare drug benefit. So sometimes it's actually coming from the government directly as taxpayers. But in any case, it's going to drug companies because the government gives the drug companies patent monopolies. They'll arrest people who produce these drugs.
Okay, well, that's a huge sum of money. So you go, okay, well, how else could we do this? Well, I mentioned before, we have the National Institutes of Health. You could expand public funding for biomedical research. And that should be the sort of thing we'd be talking about. Is this a better way to do it? Well, I'm not gonna say it's a slam dunk, but the idea it's not even on the agenda is kind of incredible. And it's not just the money. If, you know, the New York Times, I criticize the Times a lot and the media coverage in general of economic issues. It's one of the things I do have a blog on that, Beat the Press, and love to do my blog. But one of the things the Times has done a very good job of is reporting on malfeasance of drug companies. It's rare you'll have a month go by where there's not a story about a drug company lying about the effectiveness of its drugs, either concealing the fact that they might be harmful, or sometimes they have evidence that they really aren't very effective. Well, why would they lie about it? Well, because we gave them a monopoly that gives them enormous incentives. This is again a case where I beat up my friends in the economics profession, because there's a whole literature about how trade protection, tariffs and quotas are really bad, because if they could sell this shirt for, you can get it from China for $20, and they're instead, we give them a 20% tariff, and they're now sells for $24. Well, that $4 difference, we've given them a really big incentive to, bribe members of Congress and to do this and that. Okay, well, with prescription drugs, we're not talking about a 20% tariff. We're talking about maybe a 20,000%. It would sell for $5 in the free market. Instead, it's going to sell for $1,000. What do we think will happen? Well, the textbook economics tell us they'll lie, cheat, and steal to sell as many of these drugs as possible, and that's exactly what they do. So, if we had a serious discussion, again, I don't have all the data on this. I've done a few things on it, a few other people have also. It's hard for me to believe we would end up with the patent system. There's other ways to finance research. This is an enormous transfer from, us as individuals or taxpayers to the drug companies, Pfizer, Merck, people who work there, executives or top positions. They make lots of money on this, and it's absolutely not the free market. Okay. I could go on at length about this, and I used to think, well, patents in the drug industry, pharmaceutical industry, were the worst. A friend of mine goes, well, don't you know about the tech sector? Anyone who follows stuff closely, probably a lot of people connect with Microsoft. I'm not going to beat on Microsoft here for the moment, but if you look at the main way in which Apple and Samsung are competing, do people know how Apple and Samsung compete these days?
Patent wars.
Patent wars, yeah. They both are suing each other up the wazoo, hiring, really expensive lawyers, because there's billions of dollars at stake, quite literally, and they're trying to get the other companies' phones off the market, the products, not just phones, iPads, they're competing by, claiming patents, and what both of them do, it's not just them, everyone does this now, they run down and they patent every damn thing in sight, with the hope that they could use this against the competitor. In fact, there was a great story, and people didn't believe me, but this is my assessment, this is the business verse. Google bought up a division of Motorola. People see about this was about a year ago. They bought up a division of Motorola. So why did they buy up this division of Motorola? Well, they bought them for the patents. Did they want to use the patents? No. They wanted to be able to countersue Microsoft or Google or Apple or Samsung. This is part of business competition now, because they know they're going to be sued. The idea is you have a countersuit, and then at the end of the day, you shake hands and go, okay, you drop yours, we'll drop ours. This is not helping innovation. So again, this is government interference in the market. Some companies are getting very rich. A lot of lawyers are getting very rich off this, and it has nothing to do with promoting innovation. Okay, so these are areas, and I could go on. I won't go in great detail. Some of you, the Stop Online Piracy Act, some of you might have followed that. This was defeated last year. It was an effort to increase penalties for companies that allowed copyrighted material to go up on their website, which Google got very upset about, as did some other companies, because basically it makes them copyright cops. As it stands now, if I have a copyright something, I can call up a website and say, hey, you have to take it down, and they have to do that. This would require them to act proactively. So everyone has to help me enforce my copyright. It's not a free market.
Well, it's a nice arrangement.
Excuse me?
It's a nice arrangement.
Nice arrangement, yeah. So these are very large sums of money. And again, a lot of people will concede this to me and think it's a sidebar. And you go, wait a second, drugs are 2% of the economy. The tech sector, that's depending how broadly or narrowly we construct it, that's probably about 10% of the economy. We're talking about very, very large chunks of the economy that are tied up with these sorts of intellectual property arrangements. That, again, you could defend them. You know, you could say that, you know, they all serve a purpose, but they are not the free market. These are very, very clear forms of government intervention. And that's, I think, really important for us to understand, both as policy, you know, what's the best policy here, but also as politics. The people who advocate these things cannot tell us they're big free market types. They're not. They're for government protection. Okay, well, the second issue, trade. You know, in DC, you know, there's an enormous conceit, this idea that, you know, we have intellectual types, people do intellectual work, we're going to be okay, you know, I'll beat up on Thomas Friedman here because he's a great character. This is exactly what he says, you know, we have to work smarter, not harder.
He's
You
an
know,
easy target.
and, you know, he's obviously a smart guy. You know, so the people who work smart are going to do real well in the global economy, but the people who work with their back, you know, well, they're in trouble because, you know, those guys in China are willing to work for 50 cents an hour. You know, and so he goes, okay, that's the big problem that, you know, we're just going to have to get better educated in the sense. Well, that's fine. I mean, I don't plan people to be better educated. That's not a bad thing. And I don't think any of us in this room would ever say we want it easier. You know, John's working. How can we make it easier for people to go to college? So it's not the issue. We don't want people to be able to get educated. I think that's a good thing. But the point here is that the people who, you know, either didn't get educated now or may not in the future, they're not being hurt just because they didn't get educated. They're being hurt because we made it as easy possible by deliberate policy to import manufactured goods from China, Mexico, wherever you could find the cheapest labor anywhere in the world. And, you know, we're told that's free trade. Excuse me.
Is that your dog?
My dog's calling. He heard what I was saying about him. Okay, so that's ostensibly free trade. We made it as easy as possible to get steel from China and clothes and this and that. Okay, drives down wages in those sectors. That's 100% predicted, by the way. I mean, again, you know, people, you go, this is like textbook trade theory. Then when it happens, they say, oh, you can't blame trade. You go, that is the theory. You know, what are you telling me? You know, the theory doesn't hold in this case. But the point here is not that that's not free trade. That is. But there's a flip side. Why is it that we don't have doctors from China? Why is it that we don't have lawyers from China, India, wherever it might be? Well, we don't have them because we have trade policies that make it very, very difficult for them to enter the country. And in fact, I remember back in the late 90s, there was a debate over foreign doctors coming into the United States. And the two sides of the argument, on the one hand, you had the American Medical Association and the other doctors' lobbies. They say, oh, we have all these foreign doctors that were coming into the country and they're driving down wages of our doctors. And the counter-argument was, it wasn't the economist argument that, yeah, they're driving down the wages of doctors and that's good for consumers.
Right.
The counter-argument was, no, you know, these foreign doctors are coming, they're working in inner city areas, rural areas, that our native foreign doctors don't want to work. And that was the way it was covered. You know, the New York Times, Washington Post, they didn't have the economist argument that, no, yeah, they're driving, that's what you want, that's a free market. No, no one said that. And I've raised this with economists, including trade economists, and almost invariably they look at me and go, what are you talking about?
Why would we do this?
And what's striking is, you know, when we put up tariffs, President Bush put tariffs briefly on imported steel. You know, there were 3 years we put that in, and it was actually probably a very good thing. It probably kept the steel industry alive through a transition period, so it's probably actually a very good policy. They all knew about that. They could all tell you how costly that was. Well, I don't have the number at my fingertip, but I think the value of steel sold in a year is around 20 or 30 billion. What we pay for our doctors in a year, it's around 200 billion. So why is it that trade economists are so fixated on steel that we paid more than we should have? They don't even know about how much we might be paying more for our doctors than, you know, we could have if we had free trade. Okay, again, we could debate the policy, but the point here is we've designed trade agreements quite explicitly to make it as easy as possible to get, you know, clothes, steel, all these manufactured goods from the cheapest producers, lowest cost labor. That is explicit policy. Predicted result of that, drive down the wages of our manufactured workers. Large segment of the workforce. Because also these people then crowd into other sectors, drives down wages, large sectors of the workforce. We've done the exact opposite. The result of that debate in the late 90s was actually tighten the restrictions on foreign doctors coming in the country. And let me just point out for anyone who was wondering about this, no one raised the issue that we were getting incompetent foreign doctors. That was never raised. Not to say that it was never an issue, but that was never the argument. The AMA was not saying we're getting these people from India and driving down wages.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's a very, very important point, that the winners here, that you have professionals in this country that still generally have fairly high incomes, which, you know, again, I'm not gonna say necessarily a bad thing, but the point is, it's not just the market. We rigged the institutions to ensure that they would get high wages. They don't face the same sort of competition as our manufacturing workers. I like to put this, that the difference between an auto worker and an economist is auto workers are smart enough to know that they need protection, but not powerful enough to get it. Economists are too dumb to know that they need protection, but they're powerful enough to get it. So, okay, so that's the story with trade. I can go on, I'll restrain myself. I will actually, you know, in going through that, I was just reminded, I think maybe I didn't mention Krugman here, maybe it was this morning, but Krugman, in sort of interesting relations with Paul Krugman, because back in the 90s, you know, I and my friends in Washington were probably opposite side of Krugman on like 90% of issues. And today we're probably on the same side, like 99% of the time. One of the issues that were on the opposite side was trade. And back in the 90s, he totally poo-pooed the idea that trade was depressing wages. Whereas recently he's flipped and he said, you know, well, look, there is serious evidence we're importing huge amounts of manufacturing goods from China and other countries. I shouldn't just pick on China here. And the evidence suggests that it is having a substantial effect in lowering wages. And he recently wrote a very good paper about that, sort of documenting that case. So, anyhow, virtues of Paul Krugman.
Yeah.
We're trying to get him to be Treasury Secretary.
Right.
There's a petition online.
Sign a petition.
He's really good at pointing things out after the fact.
Well, he did write about the housing bubble before the fact.
Really? Because I caught you writing about it.
I sent him my stuff and he wrote about it. No, it's glad to see it out there. Okay, third point. In terms of talking about, you know, unemployment, you know, demand for labor, the point here is that the length of a work year is not something that's carved in stone. And one of the things that's very striking, if you compare the United States to West Europe, you know, Germany, France, Italy, whoever you think are good basic comparison, we've far and away the longest average work years. So the average work year in the United States, it really hasn't changed very much in the last 30 years. It's around 2,000 hours, you know, 50 hours a week, maybe 40 hours a week, 50 days a year. That's basically the story. I mean, obviously people do have some vacation time, tends to be the better paying, you know, more educated workers are more likely to have vacation time, family leave if there's a health issue or, you know, a child, paid sick days. I mean, you know, people do have them, but it's not, obviously not everyone, and disproportionately better educated, better paid people. Well, in Europe, it's a very different story. It's absolutely the norm. Part of being in the European Union, to be in the European Union, you have to have at least 4 weeks a year paid vacation. And what's striking, of course, many countries have more. You know, many countries have 5. My wife's Danish, and shortly after we started living together, Denmark had a national strike because at the time they had 5 weeks a year vacation, and the workers wanted 6. They compromised, they got 5.5. So, I mean, it's the sort of thing that just sounds absurd. But, you know, this is in Denmark, this is like across the spectrum. You know, this is just, you know, no political party gets out there and says, no, we shouldn't do this. You know, so you know, you have the Social Democrats, which of course are aligned with labor, and they were the, you know, more in support of that. Christian Democrats don't run on reversing that. You know, so this is just part of the accepted, you know, the framing of labor relations. You know, again, sick days, you know, just taken for granted everywhere. Paid family leave, I mean, there's variations, some are more, some less, but you won't find anyone that doesn't have at least 6 months paid family leave. So, I mean, it's a very, very different story. Now, this is really important for 2 reasons. One, the obvious one, that, you know, obviously you have a kid or, you know, a sick family member, you want to be able to spend time with them, that's very important. I think vacation's great, you know, that people could have some time away from work. But the other part of that story is what it does in terms of, you know, pushing us closer towards full employment. Because getting back to the point I was making earlier, we don't have a fixed amount of time we have to work. It's not that, you know, God told us that, you know, you work 2,000 hours a year. That's institutionally determined, and it could change, and it has changed in Europe. It's had changed here. We used to work long, you know, 48-hour work week, go back far enough, used to be standard. There's no reason on earth we shouldn't be looking to shorten the work week. And one of the nice things about this is that this is something that, you know, a lot of things I'm talking about, patents, copyrights, you can do some things at the state and local level, but hard to do. Trade policy, very hard to do at the state and local level. This is something you can do at the state and local level, and of course ELI has been doing that. If you could look to try to shorten work weeks, and one of the policies that goes this direction, work sharing, that's something that can and is in fact being done at the state level. I'm saying work sharing, I don't know if people have heard me before here, probably know the problem with work sharing, but basic story of work sharing is instead of laying off workers, if you get companies simply to shorten the work week and have part of the time lost made up by, unemployment benefits in effect, that would be, to my view, at least a much, much better policy. And that actually is already in the law. You would have work sharing in Washington State, and I think it's now 25 states in total have work sharing. The take-up rate, unfortunately, is very, very low. Washington's second highest after Rhode Island. But this is a part of the unemployment system, and there's no reason it can't, in fact, be expanded hugely. And I should point out, I know you have serious budget straits, this is in a certain sense free money, because part of the act that extended the payroll tax cut last year provided for the federal government to pick up the tab 100% on work sharing. So every worker that you get off unemployment insurance and instead into a work sharing program, you save their benefits. So that's free money. I mean, that's, it seems that's got to beat cutting K through 12 education, whatever else is on the agenda. And given that you're not raising anyone's taxes anytime soon, that might be a good way to get some money. But, in terms of the impact of that on the economy, people look to Germany and they often say, oh, Germany's this great success story. Germany's unemployment rate's like 5.4%. That's not an exact number. It's close to that. I haven't looked at the number for last month, but somewhere around 5.4. I mean, it might be 5.5 or 5.3, so it's not 7. So it's roughly 5.4%. A lot of people look at that and they go, oh, Germany's this great growth model, it's behemoth, huge exports, this and that. Well, some of that's true in the sense they do have a big trade surplus, they have a lot of, cutting edge industries that can point to that. But the difference between Germany and the United States is not growth. Their growth since the start of the downturn in 2007 is just about identical to the United States. The difference has been that they've been very aggressive in pushing work sharing and other policies that encourage employers to keep people on the payroll, working shorter hours, rather than laying them off. And, again, it's the same sort of story, so to take their standard one, and there's 1,001 variations of it, but to take the standard one, cut the work week by 20%, what they do is the government picks up 60% of the lost wages, 12% of the total wage bill. They have the company pick up 20% of the lost wages, 4% of the total wage bill, and the worker ends up taking home 4% less money. They work 20% fewer hours, take home 4% less money. It doesn't seem like a bad way to ride out the recession. And as I say, that's been incredibly effective there. 5.4% unemployment. They started the recession with 7.8. And what's really neat about this, you'd raise that here and people think this is really radical policy. It's a policy that's supported across the political spectrum. So it really got started, this is on their books from the late 70s, but it really got started, the program was expanded and re-energized back in 2008 when they had a unity government there, so the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats in the government together. Social Democrats subsequently lost the next election, so the Christian Democrats were governing alone with their conservative partners. They totally embraced this. So Angela Merkel, who's the conservative chancellor there, 100% behind the program. So this is endorsed across the political spectrum. The unions are happy with it. The employers are happy with it. The employers are happy with the simple reason that, they're operating from the standpoint that, one day, hopefully not too far in the future, they're going to be looking to expand production. They don't want to have to go out, look for a worker, train that worker. They'd much rather have this person on the payroll now, and, when they need to expand production, instead of having them work 30 hours a week, they'll have them work 35 or 40. It's right there. So this has been an arrangement that's worked for everyone, and, it prevents them from having the sort of large-scale unemployment that we see in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I understand we're not Germany, we can't snap our fingers and go from here to there, but we can try to take steps that way, and, I think there's really no reason not to. Part of this story, insofar as you could shorten work time through paid sick days, paid family leave, that's a great thing, but also, as I say, work sharing, that's directly on the agenda now, free money for the state of Washington, or any state that does it, that's a really good way to move towards shortening work time, work weeks, work years, however you want to put that. Well, let me just sort of sum up and take questions, because I know you all agree with everything I just said. I think it's really important for us to move away from a framing, and I don't want to implicate anyone here, but certainly in DC, you have this put endlessly that, you know, there are those conservatives out there, they like the market, and we like the government. And I think that's, as I say, I think it's horrible politics. People are suspicious of the government, often with good cause. You know, saying we like the government, they like the market. We've just given away half the store. And I think it's really important for us to say, look, you guys like the government. You know, the market didn't give you copyrights. The market didn't give us protection for doctors. The market didn't say that we have a 2,000-hour-a-year work week. These were all governmental institutions. And let's get out of this nonsense. You're the ones who like the market, we like the government. We both recognize we need the government for certain things. We want the market for many things. The question is how we want the government to structure markets. That's the discussion. That's the debate we have to have. And so I'll stop with that.
So I've heard your discussion of trade a bunch of times, and you use this example of lawyers and doctors, and I got to say it just makes me a little uncomfortable. It was never my goal to lower the standard of living of doctors and lawyers. It was my goal to raise the standard of living of everybody else. And you gave a great example of Denmark and the European Union, the way they did it. In order to get into the European Union, you had to raise your social system, and they, before Ireland got in, the rest of the European countries made investments in Ireland, so and Italy and Greece, you know, when they got into the Union. So they managed their trade policy in a way that raised living standards and created a demand for, you know, a requirement for social safety net. And the basic deal in a trade agreement is if you want access to our markets, you're going to have to do something. And I guess that's the kind of trade policy that I would like to see, that in order to have access to our markets, you're going to have to meet these social conditions in addition to things about, you know, tariffs or intellectual property, right? That the large corporations are getting their needs met in this deal, but society isn't getting its needs met in America, although they did it in Europe.
Well, in terms of, you know, lowering standards for doctors and lawyers, we have to understand their money is our money. It's not coming from heaven. So our doctors and lawyers are getting paid like twice as much as doctors and lawyers in Europe. So it's basically, we've set up a system that we're all being taxed so that our doctors and lawyers can get twice as much money as doctors and lawyers in Europe. And, you know, I don't know any way to make that money come from heaven. So if you want to pay more for doctors and lawyers, I mean, what I would say, we could have a tip jar and, you know, people want to, you could do that. I mean, I want, you know, we have most of our workforce being subject to this sort of international competition. Look, I was opposed to deals, but they're there. We can't reverse 20 years of history. They're there. What we can try to do is say, okay, if we're going to do that to our auto workers, to our textile workers, to all the, you know, people who, you know, don't have the better paying jobs, why can't we do that to the people who do have the better paying jobs? So that's kind of my attitude.
Sure.
So, oh, by the way, an MRI in Japan costs $99, $2,500 in this country.
Yeah.
Minimum. Yeah, so back to the work sharing idea, because we do have work sharing in this state. We jumped on that, but it's been kind of puzzling that we haven't had more companies take advantage of it. And I'm not sure whether there's a real lack of coordination or communication at the corporate level, or why is it that we don't have CEOs and corporations working on policies or on programs that will increase employment or at least retain their workforce? It's been really puzzling to me because it makes so much common sense to do this work sharing, and yet the take-up is so low.
I think, and I can't comment about Washington State specifically, but I would say I think in general, there's a couple things here. One is inertia. You know, so you do what you did last time. You know, that was lay people off, and that's you know, come to appreciate a really, really powerful force in all sorts of things. You know, so it's always easy to do the thing you did last time. The other thing is people don't know about it. I was once at a meeting in Washington, and this guy who has Nucor, one of the big steel companies,
Nucor is one, yeah.
and he was So I said, well, you take advantage of these work sharing programs. Looked at me, what? And he literally, had- this is a Fortune 500 company, it's a large company, and, I don't know, all the states they operate, so I can't say for certain, but odds are at least one of them had that, and he had no idea what I was talking
Just
about.
rampant ignorance at the corporate board level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think there's really a lack of knowledge, and, this is something, as I say, it's kind of, we're saying here, like, how can you get people to know about it, because it's voluntary. I mean, I was on some Fox show, and they're going, I want to give them a choice, what's wrong with that, And, if they decide it doesn't work for their company, I mean, I wouldn't say under no circumstances would I like to be able to force them, but in any case, that's not on the agenda right now. It's just about giving them the choice, letting them know it's there, you have another option, and, there's lots of reasons for thinking it's a better option for the company.
Maybe not structure. My understanding is that you have to be under 20 hours, which means you lose your benefits.
You don't, well, I can't speak for Washington State, but in general, you don't have to be under 20 hours. There are aspects, of the program that, most of these programs were put in place in the late 70s, early 80s, they are overly bureaucratic, and, insofar as they can be more flexible, at least in my view, I mean, flexibility, I think in this case is a real virtue, because what often is the case is an employer is gonna have to come in there and go, okay, I wanna reduce work hours for these 20 workers, from 40 hours to 32 hours for the next 4 months. And if they make any changes, suppose someone quits, suppose he wants to promote someone, he has to work this all out, go back there, restructure everything. So if you could make that more flexible so that they don't have to have everything in stone, I think that it might increase uptake. Again, I don't know how it's like in Washington State, but in many areas, many states, it is very rigid, so it makes it, they just go, just like.
Well, Dean, are there examples of where that's happening?
Rhode Island has been been forefront in the take-up. Their take-up rate, I forget the exact number, but they're like twice what everyone else is, and that is because they have been, their employment office tells people when they come, you could do this, do you know about work sharing? They've really made a point of promoting it, so there's much more knowledge of it in Rhode Island than most other states.
Catherine, you had a question.
I have a question, maybe not so much for Dean, but maybe more for people who work more holistically than just economics, and that is, I've been thinking about this same sort of concept that, most of the men that I know work way more than 40 hours a week. And what about the social gains that could be made by having people work less and having them more engaged with their families and communities? And would trying to make that argument just muddy things way too much?
Family values.
Not family values, but I mean,
Yeah, but it is.
community values, I mean,
Yeah.
social values.
That is the historic labor argument.
8 hours for what you
Yeah.
I don't know the historic labor movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of thing, it's a valid argument, it really just depends on the audience. I mean, I'm an economist, so I'm arguing among economists, you just go, why you attach to a 40-hour work week, because it's not an economic argument. I mean, the argument on the other side is not an economic argument, they just think somehow there's some virtue in people working 40 hours a week. That's, your problem, you think that's a virtue, I mean, fine, but that doesn't mean people should do it. You can do it if you want, but, but no, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Why on earth should we think that everyone should be working long hours? There's lots of advantages for people working much shorter hours for family, have time with family.
But they're intangible, they're not quantifiable in the short term. They don't, it's hard to argue that they affect the bottom line of either the country or the individual companies. And therefore, it's invisible.
I have two unrelated things I'd like to throw out for your comments. First of all, in speaking of the labor market, I think something that skews the labor market tremendously is the linkage to health insurance. It's so artificial, and I don't understand that there's some sense to it. I understand how it develops, but it's a linkage that really messes things up. Is there any way out of that morass?
Well, better or worse, I think we're actually coming out of that fairly quickly. The point, it's a very, very important point. One of the reasons why employers in the United States have not wanted to cut work weeks is because most people do have employer-provided health insurance, and it generally, we're seeing some movement away from that now, not necessarily a good thing, but it generally was a per-worker cost. So you have a worker work for you for 35 hours a week or 50 hours a week, you're going to pay the last major strike they had in the auto industry was against GM, it was over forced overtime. GM would rather pay people double time, you know, than hire another worker, and that was because it wasn't just health insurance, but you had such large overhead costs. And this is, again, this is not the market, this was, you know, we had this institution, employer-provided health insurance, government, you know, tax favored, you know, this is not the market, this is government design. So when people say you want to artificially shorten the length of the worker, you artificially lengthen, I mean, this, you know, it was not, this didn't just happen, you know, this is a government institution. Now, the reason why I'm saying we're moving away from it, employer-provided health insurance has been plummeting the last 5 years. It just, you know, the coverage rate, obviously largely because of the recession. You know, I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying it's
Well,
happened.
it's a disincentive to full employment because companies want to get people below that threshold when they have to pay their insurance.
Well, I mean, it's their option. I mean, it's not that anyone's required to, oh, you're talking about once we have the ACA in effect, the Affordable Care Act. Well, that's the other thing. Once we have the Affordable Care Act in, you know, assuming it works, and I'm hoping, you know, we'll see for sure in a couple of years, but assuming that you get the exchanges up and running and they're reasonably good, you're gonna have a lot of employers that are gonna decide, you know, why bother with this? You know, I'd say for myself, and then we have a union, so we'll decide with our workers, but, you know, if we could get good insurance through the exchange, guess what? We're not gonna deal with it. I mean, you know, we're not taking advantage of the get cut and pay. It's just, you know, it's, you know, why should I be deciding my workers' insurance? I mean, that really doesn't make any sense. So if the exchanges work as we might hope they would work, I think you're gonna see a very quick fall off in employer-provided insurance.
Is there any, I guess I'm wondering, this is back on the work hours question, if there's an economic cost to the overwork side, but I'll just give you the example, which is, I did this big project, getting students involved in elections in about 20 states, and our partners, we did it in 08, and after, in a whole lot of the same institutions and same people started dropping the ball on things, because they had their plates double of their workload, and this is the nonprofit world, and it was just like, wait a moment, this is the same person who did a brilliant job in 08 at this institution, why are things falling through the cracks? And the answer, at least my answer was, you know, they're still a good person, but they're not noticing this because they've got 47 other things. It just seems to make sense that would also be true in the for-profit world. And when you, I mean, certainly friends of mine trying to do too much work with too little time. I just wonder if there's an economic, you know, there's a way to happen.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there is, and I'm sure there's research, you know, like, I mean, it just stands to reason that, you know, your productivity and all sorts of things falls, and you're working your job 48, 50, 55 hours a week, which a lot of people get stuck doing, so. You know, again, I'm sure there's research on that. I don't know if it's gotten to the point of, you know, trying to quantify in dollars and cents terms, but you probably could do that. I personally have not done it, I don't know anyone who has, but I'd be surprised if there's not a very substantial cost to that.
It's a good reason to be very skeptical when someone from the White House imposes some senior advisor, well, I've been up for 48 hours, you know, we're gonna think, well, geez, what
Good
kind of
for you.
Join the club. I think there is a literature that shows that the U.S., we are more productive, say, than European workers per capita, but we are approaching the threshold of diminishing returns on productivity. I mean, so there actually is a literature that suggests it's not simply, you know, infinitely, our productivity is not infinite. We really are at, or there is some diminishing returns on our productivity.
If you look, productivity is not measured very well across the country, but most of the data shows that productivity per worker, we're somewhere around 20–25% higher. Productivity per hour, very marginally different. So I'm comparing against the wealthier countries. I mean, obviously we're still a lot above Greece or Portugal, the poorer countries in Europe, but if you compare us to France, Germany, productivity per hour, we're within measurement error.
Sure, Jane.
Yeah, so most people probably know, but Paul is famous for motivating volunteer work. And where you will find the research that you're looking for is in the availability of volunteer hours and the change over the last 20 years in the way people are making themselves available to volunteer. And they're much less likely to take on long-term positions and long-term projects, and they basically are demanding short-term beginning and ending things because they can't make these promises because work gets in the way. where you would wanna cut your study off at 2007, because when you become unemployed, all of a sudden, you fill your time with volunteer work, because it's the only way to feel good about those skills that are otherwise going to waste.
Yeah, well, that's probably one of the reasons I was kind of laughing about this. My wife volunteers at an animal shelter in our area, the Washington Humane Society.
Went to more beach house.
Once more, she can't bring home beach nuts. But it's actually kind of funny, because they just had a new director, volunteer coordinator, whatever the exact position is. And this person came in, she was from New Zealand, and clearly a very, very different culture. She said she wants people to put down that they're gonna come in, 4 hours, the same 4 hours every week. And my wife's starting a situation where she can kind of do that. She works part-time at home, but most people in Washington are not. And she's going, well, she's not gonna listen to me, she'll figure this out.
But there's studies like the American Volunteer Coordinators Association, whatever it's called, does have that data.
Yeah, I might take a look at that.
Johnny?
So we had a quantum leap in this area in the United States in the 1880s when the work week, suddenly was negotiated and went down to 40 hours from 48, 56. I assume those workers, although I've never actually read this, got the same wage for 40 hours that they had been getting for 48, and it was labor movement inspired. But why did that happen then, and why wouldn't something comparable like that happen now?
It will take, I think, a big movement to accomplish a big change like that, but it was the labor movement in the 80s, and then again in, the Fair Labor Standards Act, where you institutionalized, nationwide the 40-hour work week. And, I think since then, it hadn't been a priority for labor, because they were focusing on getting more pay and getting increased benefits. And I think a really big problem was that you locked in the system with the high overhead costs, because you had pensions. Again, this is kind of, for younger people, what the hell's a defined benefit pension, but when you had these benefits, these expensive benefits that were per worker, that gave a really strong incentive to just say, no, we're gonna work you overtime, double time, but we don't wanna hire more workers. And, obviously, we gotta go away from that. Better or worse, we're going away from that in part because those benefits are disappearing.
I'm sort of curious about that. Who here knows what a defined benefit pension is?
We're all old.
Those of us who aren't getting it know what they are.
I had to just explain this to my daughter in terms of a job choice she was making, because kids don't know anything about this.
And there was a choice that included a defined benefit plan?
Well, there was a choice between two jobs, and I said, let me tell you about public employment and defined benefits and getting in before these things get grandfathered and abolished. So.
Because in the course of their training and professional work, they haven't had to deal with that. That's,
I'll be honest, I have no idea what it is.
So,
I'm always one of the younger people in the room.
We should have a little communications test. All right, wait, before you explain it.
No, but most jobs I've had don't even come with benefits.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Let's have a little communications test. Anyone can explain it, but we'll start the timer, and in 30 seconds, just consider the channel having been switched. Okay, go.
Defined benefit means that you get a benefit that's a fraction of your salary, you get it through your retirement. So it doesn't depend on whether you invest in the stock market, what the stock market does. You're gonna get, after you've worked for 30 years and you reach 60 or 62 or 65, you'll get 60% of your salary. So it's a guarantee.
Nice.
very good.
I find it very interesting that you never see any economic analysis of the tremendous cost of that. When my uncle died, who had been a government worker, I calculated how much money he had actually made in his career and how many years he worked versus how much money he got in his defined benefit plan. And it was tremendous. He put a total of $17,000 into his retirement. And he lived off of that, meaning he lived off of me, us, for 35 years, getting
But-
$3,500.
But his friend died the next day after he retired.
And the power.
No, but I mean, but it's very
But the power of
interesting.
that invested dollar at that time when he invested it multiplied. I mean, that's the whole deal.
Exactly, and which is why the next step is talking about the fact that one of the reasons why my generation won't get those kind of benefits is because interest rates are so incredibly different now than they were then. That's another aspect of retirement, of generational changes in benefits that's not really discussed. So I was wondering if you have come
Well, they weren't
across
all
that
invested
kind of.
either. They were pirated for other purposes.
Right.
But that's,
They should have finished.
you definitely can make that argument. But in terms of looking at why he was able to do that, like when they set up those policies, the assumptions that were made about the return that the government would make on defined pension plans versus now, and there's an argument to be made government versus private, and private, but anyway, I'm just wondering if you're seeing research out there that's sort of comparing the era change.
Yeah, I've done the research,
Of the
and
fine.
and
And if you
and
could
I can
speak
tell
to
you,
that.
it's really just fine, that, in fact, and I can't comment about any particular plan,
That's right.
but there are two components. I mean, you invest in part in interest-bearing assets, but most pensions are in equities, in stock.
That's right.
And in fact, given that we've had this big plunge in the stock market, you should project pretty good returns going forward. The big problem was actually in the 1990s, when you had stock prices that were totally out of line with the fundamentals, and you had these people projecting high returns that were literally absurd. And I was trying to tell people that, and they didn't want to hear it. But that was the reality. But today, you in fact can get those good returns.
Right.
But
So,
You
my
can.
understanding is that in terms of Social Security, in terms of talking about the government, and in terms of government pensions, that initially, anyway, for the 1950s up to the 1980s, those weren't invested in anything but treasuries, earning high interest rates.
Well, they weren't earning that high interest rates, but.
Or increasing interest rates as people got older.
There's some long questions here, but just briefly, they tended to invest public pension funds, not private pension funds, but public pension funds were largely invested in treasury, which actually got fairly low returns in that period, because what matters is what the return is relative to inflation.
Right.
And the returns relative to inflation were actually pretty low, in many years negative in the 70s. They increased in the 80s, but that was at the point where they started to move into stocks. So it was actually not a
Okay,
great
so
story.
that's why
Yeah.
it was offset.
But in principle, there's no reason why you can't get good returns going forward. And, I'm a big fan of defined benefit pensions. I mean, I don't think we're going to go back to the company-based pensions, but I think we do need some sort of universal pension scheme that everyone can buy into.
EOI has a plan.
Isn't that really the
Social
key difference?
Security.
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't that what was?
Well, California just signed into law a sort of
Correct.
voluntary pension
Yeah.
plan for everybody, a universal one. And I wonder if other states are looking at that because.
Well,
it
we
just-
actually,
I know.
that was modeled on
EOI.
legislation that we
I know.
developed.
I'm not talking just about Washington and California. though.
No, other states
It's
definitely are.
Are they? Because
Connecticut.
that's an answer.
There's about 8 or 9 states that
Are
are
they good?
looking at it
Excellent.
right now.
Because if you can get 6 or 8 states to do something on this, then it can influence the feds.
Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York,
Good, okay.
All right.
Maryland.
Pennsylvania. is
So how does it work?
It's an open system that anybody can buy into as an individual worker.
And
say,
it
"I
takes
want a pension
advantage of the
fund."
public funds that
Right.
already exist, say CalPERS in California, so they would sort of piggyback them, they wouldn't
So
be
you've got
intermingling funds.
a lot more leverage because it's combined, it's not an individual, you're not eaten by fees.
The administrative costs are like negligible, right?
Yeah.
Is that
Compared to
because,
private pension
It's
funds.
it's a situation where a lot of employers are, the inertia, we were talking about inertia before. There's a lot of inertia to starting in a retirement plan for private employers. It's just, there's so much disinformation and misinformation and an overwhelming amount of information that the easiest thing is to not do anything.
Do a 401K.
We're talking about 401Ks.
Right.
So this is actually, would be, the government, the state, would
Right.
either establish itself or similar type product to a 401K that any employer and any employee could participate in. So in doing that, you push down the barriers of entry, you push down the information costs and
Right.
the administration costs,
Yeah.
and the entry costs, and so we'll see. We hope that it opens it up to a lot more work.
The California one is only open to individuals.
It'd be like, yes. TIA
Not
cards.
employers.
Portable,
Yeah.
you can.
The idea is it'd be portable from job to job.
Yeah, so you'd own your own account.
Your own account, right. It's like social security.
I was just gonna ask whether one of the, whether you find it useful to explain this idea of, facing retirement alone versus as part of a group. I mean, essentially, I think of pensions as retirement insurance, right? I'm with a whole group of people, whether I know it or not, and while I'm retired, there's a whole bunch of people who are continuing to pay into the fund that helps smooth out the curve, as opposed to me having to save individually for every possible vagary of life from age 65 on, and, maybe the stock market works, maybe it doesn't. The pension lets us, weather the storm together.
One of the things that's changed since, I was in grad school, which was exactly ancient history. When I first learned, it's a very simple economic argument, that used to think was, like universally accepted in the profession, that, it makes sense to have a party that could best accept risk to accept it. So the argument about defined benefit pensions, why does a firm give a worker a defined benefit pension instead of just handing them money? And the argument was that, well, because the firm doesn't give a damn, the firm's gonna be there in principle forever, and they don't care if the stock market's down in 2003 because it's gonna be up in 2005 or whatever. They don't care about the timing, whereas if you're, hitting retirement age in 2003 and the market's down, you're screwed. So the firm gives the worker this insurance, which is essentially at no cost to the firm and of great value to the worker. So it's worth more than they just gave you the dollars. But you have this mentality in Washington, they go, oh, the firms can't take that risk. So the workers can? Just like, what on earth does that mean? The people will say that, they're patting themselves on the back. I was at a hearing, Utah was being touted because they got rid of their defined benefit pensions and they now have defined contribution. They actually didn't reduce what they're contributing. So they didn't save the taxpayers a penny. All they did was shift the risk to workers. Well, that's really good. This one, Mark. Yeah.
I wanted to shift a little bit to ask about what's happening in Washington around some of these market interferences, like some of the things that are coming out of the states, like minimum wage, index minimum wage, or these kind of pensions, or paid sick leave. This is starting to happen in more progressive places. Is there any interest or movement or anything? We haven't raised the minimum wage now, it's getting raised, right, either federal minimum.
Yeah. It's a good question. There certainly is interest, and Tom Harkin from Iowa has been a big champion on this, and he's been sort of waiting to push a bill on it, and I guess the administration's asking him to hold off. I mean, there's plenty of co-sponsors, yeah. But, what's really happened here is you had this log jam, so this is, apart from all the bad things that could happen if you end up with, Medicare and Social Security and other programs being cut, the other thing that's going on, it's just crowded out everything else. So, the whole fiscal cliff thing, that was all people talking about, fiscal cliff. Now,
Now it's gonna be the debt ceiling.
yeah, so it just shoved everything else off the agenda, so there's definitely interest in that, and, I don't think you get the, well, I shouldn't say this, I was gonna say, I don't think you get the Republican Congress, but who the hell knows? The last time, no, I shouldn't say the last time, but 2 times ago, the minimum wage was increased by the Gingrich Congress. It was, you go back, Clinton, gets elected in 92, has overwhelming support, controls both houses. They didn't raise the minimum wage. Gingrich comes in 94, and he's got his agenda, contract with America, they did this and that. Everything kind of blew up in their face that the government shut down. Coming up on the election, what do? Pass minimum wage increase. Hugely popular measure. So, I don't know, I wouldn't rule out that would happen, but, at the moment at least, it's this budget stuff that's, as I say, even in best case scenario where we don't see big cuts to things we care about, it does crowd out discussion of everything else.
So, let's have 2 more questions, because, Glenn?
Yes, Dean, one of the questions I had was, one of the things you mentioned in your book, or you implied, was that the left and unions and progressive people could do a much better job of connecting with the libertarian stream in American society. And that we've kind of, being all baby boomers, right, we kind of express that sentiment that doesn't so much tap into that. So is there a way to like practically think about that?
Well, you know, first off, in saying that, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think this does have resonance with people. You know, you hear all these people. I mean, some of them are not all. Some of them are really right-wing in sentiment. They want to get real rich and screw people. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But a lot of them, you know, the idea that, you know, government could be bad, you know, could be oppressive, you know, there's certainly cases. I mean, every one of us has had a bad experience with the government. If it was just, you know,
I hope so.
taking, you know, 5 hours to get your driver's license or something. I mean, you know, how could you not? Somewhere you've had some bad experience. So I think recognizing that, you know, sometimes government bad, and also we really do want markets to do a lot of things. I think all of us want markets to do a lot of things. We want them to do everything, but we want them to do a lot of things. I think it's really, really important to understand that. And in terms of, you know, how do you, you know, sort of flip things around, well, I'll just give you an example. Maybe it's not the best one, but it's been in the news. You know, what went on in Michigan, where they passed, you know, what everyone's calls right to work. And what kills me is they frame this as, you know, they're concerned about individual rights. I wrote a column saying that Michigan Republicans deny the right to work to police officers and firefighters. Well, their right to work legislation did not apply to police officers and firefighters. So anyone who really believes this is about the right to work thinks that they must really hate the police and firefighters. Everyone else got it, but not the police and firefighters. Well, obviously, that's not what happened there. They, you know, they were doing a favor for the police and firefighters. They didn't want them to oppose that. So they said, yeah, you can have contracts that require everyone to have to contribute for their representation. This had nothing to do with an individual right. What it was about was freedom of contract. What the question is, you have a group of workers, they want to sign a contract with the employer that says everyone who benefits from union representation has to pay for union representation. How does this affect the right to work? You don't like the union? I know the libertarians would say, work somewhere else.
Right.
You know, so you know, they were allowed to use libertarian language in a completely inappropriate way. We're not talking about anyone's right to work. We're talking about freedom of contract, and they're taking it away from it.